Good evening, everyone. Vox Day, Infogalactic News, and voxday.blogspot.com. Welcome to the Darkstream. I'm Vox Day, as I mentioned, and tonight I thought we'd talk a little bit about the challenge of moving beyond civic nationalism. One of the problems that people have, I noticed this on the blog. People, especially on the alt-right, get very, very upset when they see people doing what they consider to be cucking out, when they are genuflecting before the traditional vision of America as a idea, and America as a ideal, America as the shining city on the hill for everyone. But what's very important to understand is that this is a normal vision. This is a traditional vision. This is something that has been an American vision since George Washington. I've done a lot of the historical research, and what is important to understand is that although the whole issue of the melting pot and the nation of immigrants and Judeo-Christianity and Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, give us your poor, your huddled masses, even though all of that is 20th century bullshit, even though all of that is false, there is a element of truth underlying it. There is a element of truth underlying it, and you can see it when you go in and you look at the documents. Some of the letters, for example, that George Washington wrote. He writes specifically to a group of Dutch people, saying, encouraging them to come to America and saying that it's his vision, it's his dream that America will be a welcoming place for all the oppressed people in the world who want to be free. And so, that's the basis, that idea that is being expressed by the first president is the original source for America's civic nationalism. And so, and they did want people, they did need people. It was a big continent, and he specifically refers several times to this. And so, yes, you can point out, no, George Washington was not a cock. You can point out to people that, well, this was a vision for its time, this was a vision when they were trying to settle the continent and so forth and all that sort of thing. But that's not really relevant. Because the idea, the vision, proved to be false. That's the more important thing to focus on. That's the more important thing to point out, is that the vision, like communism, like libertarianism, it is a utopian vision that is not supported by reality. It is a utopian vision that is not supported by events. That's all we actually need to be able to successfully criticize it and intellectually dismiss it. However, as somebody already commented, has already noted, this giving up this attachment to utopian ideas is fundamentally emotional. It is something that people get wrapped up in the rhetoric. When people who are communists are attached emotionally to communism. Civic nationalists are attached emotionally to the idea of America for everyone. And so it's just something that you have to be aware of. And so it doesn't work to simply come at it from a purely intellectual perspective. I've come at it from a purely intellectual perspective. There's not a single civic nationalist who has been able to successfully make any sort of argument against the deconstruction and the criticism that I have brought to it. And yet, I would say that the number of people who are presented with these arguments and who are able to accept it immediately is probably somewhere between 10 and 20% tops. Even though it's very, very clear that magic dirt doesn't work. It's very clear that assimilation is not happening. Assimilation is not happening. And even more so, it is very clear that assimilation never actually happened with the earlier waves of immigration that are often cited as having been successful. You know, the Germans, the Scandinavians. There's a reason why Madison, Wisconsin, where a lot of Scandinavians were settled, was the center of Marxism in academia in the early 20th century. You know, Minnesota, where I grew up, which is also very heavily Scandinavian, is so far to the left that it has the only Labor Party. Italians have never ever understood the English system. Italians have never grasped the idea of fair play, and Italians are Italian Americans have been notoriously corrupt, because that's the way politics operates in Italy. I can tell you that as someone who's lived in Italy. You know, now I think there's actually something to be said for that sort of open corruption. Like I say, I prefer my societies pre-collapsed. I don't know enough about the Welsh to have an opinion, except for the fact that they are definitely distinct from the English. There's no question about that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that once you understand that civic nationalism is a utopian ideology like any other, then you're much more able to communicate to the civic nationalists in a way that can gradually puncture the balloon and let the air out. You know, that's why terms like magic dirt is very effective. You know, talking about paperwork Americans or paper Americans and fake Americans is also effective. Distinguishing between state and nation is effective. There was remarkably little interbreeding in the UK. You know, a lot of people for many years thought that the Scandinavian influence was very big in England, but recent DNA studies have shown that there's very little. Well, no, I mean, that's the whole point. A citizenship process doesn't change a person's nation. It doesn't, it can gradually change over a period of generations, maybe somewhere between 4 and 6, but it is very, very clear that just from Jews in the United States to Turks in Germany, it is very, very clear that 3 generations does not change a person's identity very much, if at all. The Irish in Boston are another example. I mean, why on earth are the Irish, who have been there for 4 or 5 generations, why are they sending money back to Ireland? What do they care about Ireland? They're Americans, right? No, they're not. They're Irish. They're U.S. citizens. They have, and Stefan is absolutely right about the reversion to the mean. Often, and this is one of the things that's sometimes hard for people to understand, often the first generation immigrants are exceptional. They're hard workers. They're hard workers. They behave well. They make every effort to behave as well. They behave like guests because they know they don't belong. And so that's why so often people look at them and say, oh, but these immigrants, they're wonderful people. They do the best they can, and so forth. And then meanwhile, the second and third generation, they know they're not truly of the native population, but they don't know their home culture, their native culture either. And so, when they go on their exploration of identity, that's when they start to become very, very radical and very, very different in order to set themselves apart, because they don't want to be like the people around them. And then, like the commenter just mentioned, then of course you've got all the people who who come over because their family brings them over, or because it's easier because they know people, and we're just as guilty of that as anyone else. We had, just the other day, we had one of my wife's college roommates down, and she's been living over here for about a year, and now she didn't. I don't think she came here because we live here, but it certainly made the decision when she was offered a job much, much easier. So you've got now more Americans around than you would have if you didn't have the first ones. And that's that same process, writ very large, is what tends to fundamentally transform a place. Now, of course, again, I can't stress enough, you can't judge the micro by the macro. The fact that you think that all the Eskimos have to go back does not mean that you have any antipathy for the Eskimo on your baseball team, or the Eskimo who works out at your gym or something. Okay, micro is not macro. Macro is not micro. You cannot devise functional macro societal policies based on individual examples, and you cannot judge a single individual by his entire tribal identity. Okay? These are different things. We are talking about when we're talking about civic nationalism, obviously we are talking about large groups of people that are numbered in the tens of millions. So this does not mean that you have to dislike your friend. This does not mean that you have to sever all relations with your sister's boyfriend or whatever, cousin's girlfriend. They do have to go back ultimately if they make up a significant percentage of the population. I mean, it's up to the native population. It is up to the native population. I mean, the reason that I think it is advisable for significant minorities to go back to their native lands is because, unfortunately, history strongly suggests that the likely outcome is a violent one. And that is something that I would like to see the nations of the world avoid. I would much rather see a series of ethnically homogeneous nations getting along together in peace than seeing a bunch of multicultural, multiracial states, all of which are riven by violence and war. Only a madman would support the multicultural vision if he understood what it very, very likely entails. So, and that's why it's important to communicate effectively with the civic nationalists, because they have to. They're beginning to understand that magic dirt doesn't work. They're beginning to understand that America was and is an actual nation. It's not an idea. Yeah, omni-nationalism, I think, is a useful term because it makes it very, very difficult for the media to spin it into any sort of racist, supremacist, whatever, rhetorical dismissal. They'll still do it. They'll still try it. But it's a little bit more difficult for them. It's very difficult for... I live in Europe, so... and also I'm a Native American, so your attempt to come up with a little rhetorical trap there is almost ludicrously misguided. No, omni-nationalism is actually is directly contradictory to civic nationalism. Civic nationalism is basically not national. No, it is not stupid to separate people according to their nationality. That is how people separate themselves. You have to understand that that people do not, they didn't magically why? Because they kill each other in extremely large numbers, and they engage in violent ethnic cleansing until they reach sufficiently homogeneous populations. The thing that you need to understand, and no, it's not ages ago. I mean, you're totally uneducated. The amount of ethnic cleansing that has taken place in the 20th century alone is massive, absolutely massive. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people. Okay, everywhere from Tibet to Africa to Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. All of the German land, all the Germans that were ethnically cleansed from Eastern Europe after World War II. All of this stuff is going to happen. It's happening right now in the United States. People don't realize it. How many of you are familiar with NWA? No, you are not. We're just going to have to block him. He's just too dumb. In Compton, California, which was very heavily black, it was actually one of the symbols of black American culture. It's now been ethnically cleansed of blacks, and it's now something like 85% Mexican. And so we're actively seeing Mexicans engaging in serious ethnic cleansing. And one thing that a lot of whites don't realize is that Mexicans have a pretty strong antipathy to blacks. And so the virulent racial wars in the United States are not going to involve whites and blacks. They're most likely going to involve Mexicans and blacks, and possibly to some extent Asians. And so, a lot of people are not familiar with the phrase La Razza Cosmica, or the Bronze Race. The Bronze Race is basically Mexican supremacy. And so, and this is not a new concept. I mean, these are books written by academic theoreticians back in, okay, let's get rid of these weirdos. These are books that were written, I believe, around the 1920s, 1930s. And so, anyhow, all of this stuff is already happening, and it tends to happen once the economic boom fades. This is basic socionomics. And so one of the reasons why people have been all sort of, it's a small world after all, and that sort of crap, is because we've been in the longest credit boom possibly in world history. And so now that we're beyond the peak of that boom and we're heading into the bust, that's when you're going to start seeing the exact opposite. But it's going to take a while. Am I happy about living in this time period? Not in the slightest. Not at all. I actually now retroactively feel very privileged to have been able to live during the boom. I mean, I actually got to see two booms. I was in Japan in 1988. They hit their peak in 1989, about 6 months after I left. Plus, I got the chance to live in the late 90s USA. And so, it's just one of those. It's just one of those things. Here's the thing: history doesn't care what you think. No, the great waves of history. There's a wonderful scene in War and Peace by Tolstoy, where he talks about the Great Battle of Borodino, and he's talking about Napoleon and the Russian general, I think Kutsov. And he's discussing the idea that either one of them is responsible for the results of the battle that day. And he talks about, he specifically discusses three of the ideas, Kutusov, sorry. I was pretty close. But anyhow, he's discussing the idea that the events were determined by the decisions made by these two generals. But then he shows that the crucial events of the battle took place when neither one of them could possibly have either known about what was happening, or influenced what was happening, or anticipated what was happening and given orders for it. And then he shows that they, in fact, did not give any orders for it. And so what he was demonstrating there is that even the great men, even the most powerful, influential men that we tend to credit for causing events and controlling events and dictating events, don't actually have anywhere near the impact on events that we think they do. And he talks about these great waves, and we see them in the trends of history. We see them in a much smaller magnitude in things like battles and that sort of thing. And yeah, if you haven't read War and Peace, it is absolutely worth it. Not just it's one of the few truly great books. And so, Trump is that's why I continue to support Trump in that way, because he's more important. Regardless of what he does, he was more important as a symbol of the rejection of the status quo. And so, yes, it's going to be dangerous in the United States, unfortunately. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to leave back in the late 90s. I saw this coming. I knew this was going to happen. It was inevitable by that point. It became probable after the 1965 Naturalization Act, and then it became inevitable after the 1986 immigration amnesty. So, unfortunately, for me anyhow, Europe has rendered itself similarly challenged by the migrant crisis of 2015. So, there's not going to be anywhere in the world that you can get away from this except for maybe somewhere like New Zealand. But yes, I have read about the dangers of artificial intelligence. In fact, the gentleman that I wrote that economics book on free trade, the debate, James Miller, he's actually written an entire book on it. So, I'm not reading it in Russian. So I can read Italian, I can read German, but I'm not reading Russian. So anyhow, to get back to the point about civic nationalism, there are a lot more people who are civic nationalists than are properly based with regards to immigration, ethnicity, culture, and so forth. And so you need to be patient with them. Don't call them cucks. They're not. Okay? They are simply still caught up in this beautiful vision of all these people from all around the world coming to America and, upholding the ideals that George Washington dreamed about. It's not a terrible vision. It's simply not a functional one. It's simply not a viable one, and it is no longer a credible one. My take on the Jewish question is very simple. The Jews belong in their homeland just like everybody else. Israel is their chosen homeland. They fought for it. They've earned it. We should support Jewish nationalism. If we're omni-nationalists, then we should support Jewish nationalism just like we support any other nationalism. But we support Jewish nationalism in Israel. There is nothing legitimate about saying, is it good for the Jews when you live in China, or when you live in America, or when you live in France? It's not legitimate. It's not right. And so that's the problem. There are so few of them that I don't think that that is a significant issue. I mean, that's really that's really an issue for the Jewish people to deal with. Are they really going to turn their backs on their own over differences of religion? Maybe, but that's not anyone else's problem. So, I would assume that, a place like, the U.S. and, other nations in Christendom would probably be willing to accept those people, especially because those people are willing to if they're willing to put their Christianity first, then they're probably quite willing to, put their adopted nationality first as well. And so, but again, you have to be reasonably sympathetic because you're talking about a people who didn't have a homeland. So their behavior was rational. Their behavior was perfectly sensible given their unique position. The problem, and part of the problem of the Jewish question today is that no longer applies. They have their homeland. Next year in Jerusalem. Why are you still in New York City? Because it's easier. It's understandable. It's understandable, but it's not functional. I think we got some porn spam here. Anyhow, but so I don't have any problem whatsoever with Zionism. I have a problem with I'm spam. Okay, clever. So I don't think that the Jewish question is difficult at all in terms of finding the answer. It's just very difficult for people to accept both people who are Jewish and people who are not. I've got good friends who are Jews, some in Israel, some in the USA. I think it would be very, very difficult for even though our American friends have been to Israel, I think it would be tremendously difficult and very hard on them to make that move. I've made an international move myself. It is difficult. And so, but, when everyone from my Israeli friends to the prime minister are saying, hey, come home, this is where you belong. I mean, it's not anti-Semitic to be saying exactly the same thing as the prime minister of Israel and so forth. And also because we know from history what's going to happen. The Jews have been booted out of 130 nations already. It's going to happen in America sooner or later. Maybe later rather than sooner, but it will happen. So, I'm not a big fan. In fact, I'm totally dismissive of the entire "this time it's different" thinking. I think it was possibly Churchill who said that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and so it's it's just something to. But again, it's important to look at these things, to look at these questions without getting. We're talking again on the macro societal level. We're talking about ideal practical policies. We're not talking about how we feel about our friends. We're not talking about how we feel about our acquaintances and that sort of thing. It's nothing to do with that. Nothing whatsoever. So, anyhow, so that's all I had. Let me see. I was going to ask a question about something. I can't remember. It's kind of useless. I'm here I'm thinking, okay, the one thing I want to do, I want to ask everybody a question about something, and of course I can't even remember what it was. So, but anyhow, I would encourage you guys to keep using Infogalactic News. You know, we're working on keeping it updated regularly, making sure we get 2 updates a day on the major stuff. We want to get everybody on there. Conservatives should not be attacking Ann Coulter. That's stupid. Not much to discuss there. And there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. There's a lot of conservatives moving alt-right. There's a lot of people, you know, the alt-right revolution is happening. It is happening. And so, you know, we're seeing, I mean, I think the 16 points have now been translated into 27 languages. I haven't even gotten them on there. Oh yeah, and this last thing, I encourage everyone to join the Burn Unit, help make Infogalactic bigger than Wikipedia. That's the goal, and we're going to have some new announcements about that soon. I'll look forward to seeing you all again here probably in another day or 2. Have a good evening.